Welcome to episode 3 of The Evidence Room. Inside every investigation, the truth is hidden in the evidence. Tonight, we explore one of Australia's most chilling criminal cases.
It really is one of the darkest chapters in the country's history.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I want you to just imagine this for a second. Your most prized possession, the actual key to solving the biggest string of serial murders in your country's history, is just a simple, missed weekly phone call.
Right, which sounds so mundane today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you have to picture the late 1980s and early 90s in Australia. It's this pre-smartphone, sun-drenched era of just pure freedom. For thousands of young people, grabbing a backpack and, hitchhiking down the Hume Highway wasn't just cheap travel.
No, it was a total rite of passage.
Right. You're out on the open road, relying entirely on the kindness of strangers. But beneath that really carefree image of backpacker culture, a terrifying reality was taking shape. Because while these young travelers were just, looking for adventure, a predator was mapping those exact same highways as a hunting ground.
Yeah, he was quite literally using their sense of freedom against them.
So our mission in this deep dive is to trace the evidence from a string of baffling disappearances straight into the dense, foreboding shadows of the Belanglo State Forest, and ultimately to the doorstep of a man whose very name became synonymous with evil.
And, to understand how a predator of this magnitude operates, we really first have to look at the environment that forged him. We have to examine the blueprint, so to speak.
The early years.
Exactly. Long before he ever stepped foot into Belanglo State Forest to hide a body, the foundation for his pathology was laid decades earlier. We're talking the 1940s and 50s. Ivan Milat was born in 1944. He was the fifth of 14 children to a Croatian immigrant father and an Australian mother.
Wow, 14 kids.
Yeah, a massive family growing up in a rural suburb of Sydney.
The environment you're describing, from what we know, it sounds incredibly volatile. With 13 children in a cramped rural household, supervision is obviously minimal. But the discipline is intensely harsh.
Extremely harsh and physical.
Right, and guns and knives weren't locked away. They were just lying around like ordinary household tools. There was this deeply ingrained, macho, weapon-centric culture from day one. Siblings later recalled him casually attacking animals with machetes.
Which is always a massive red flag.
Totally. And by the 1960s, his criminal record was already escalating rapidly. Break-ins, car thefts, armed robberies, even spent time at a boys' home.
And that normalization of violence is crucial here. When a child is raised in an environment where physical dominance is the primary currency, empathy just fails to develop. But the true baseline for his pathology.
It's a turning point.
Yeah, the moment the abstract violence crystallized into a specific predatory method, that occurred in 1971.
Okay, let's get into this because this part is wild.
It is. A 26-year-old Milat picked up two 18-year-old female hitchhikers near Liverpool. He drove them to an isolated dirt road, pulled a knife, and bound them with nylon cord.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and he threatened to slit their throats. He sexually assaulted one of them in the car before they managed to miraculously escape at a gas station.
Which is terrifying.
Yeah.
And then Milat fled to New Zealand after that, right?
He did, but he eventually came back and stood trial.
But what is truly staggering to me is that he was acquitted. One of the victims changed her story on the stand, and the whole case just fell apart. He walked out of that courtroom a completely free man.
Which is the worst possible outcome for public safety.
It's like a terrifying dress rehearsal. You have to wonder about the psychological impact of that exact moment. If a violent offender escalates to armed abduction and sexual assault, and the justice system completely fails to hold him accountable, does that just operate as a giant green light?
Oh, absolutely. It functions as an immense psychological accelerant. Getting away with a crime of that magnitude, it doesn't make an offender cautious. It breeds this profound, dangerous arrogance.
Like he's untouchable.
Exactly. It validated his predatory instincts and taught him a very specific lesson, which is that he could control victims and he could outsmart the consequences. But just as important as that psychological evolution was his professional evolution. Around this time, Milat took a job as a road worker for the Roads and Traffic Authority.
And that's a chilling detail when you think about the actual mechanics of his crimes later on. As a road worker, he's not just, pouring asphalt. He is gaining this intimate encyclopedic knowledge of isolated terrains.
The fire trails, the deep bushland across New South Wales.
Right. He's learning the access points, the blind spots, how the soil behaves. He's essentially being paid to map his future hunting grounds.
Precisely. He is acquiring the logistical skills necessary to hide his crimes. And by the late 1980s, his chosen hunting ground intersects perfectly with a cultural phenomenon.
The hitchhiking boom.
Yes. Hitching a ride was totally normalized then. You didn't think twice about getting into a stranger's car. It was just this adventurous, expected part of youth travel.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the disappearances. The timeline officially begins in December 1989. A young Australian couple, Deborah Everest and James Gibson, they just disappear without a trace.
Just gone.
Yeah. And then over a year later, in January 1991, German backpacker Simone Schmidl vanishes. By December 1991, another German couple, Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied, go missing. And finally, in April 1992, British backpackers Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters vanish right after leaving King's Cross in Sydney.
7 young, vibrant lives.
Just completely erased from the map.
And this really highlights the specific vulnerability of the victims he chose. Backpackers are, by definition, transient. They're far from home, moving unpredictably without, fixed itineraries.
Right, but wait, I struggle to understand this timeline mechanically. We're talking about 7 people vanishing over the span of roughly 2.5 years. How does a pattern like that not trigger a massive nationwide panic immediately?
It's a great question.
Were authorities just writing them off as runaway transients who wanted to, I don't know, disappear?
Well, you have to look at how backpacking functioned in the pre-digital era. The entire premise was to go off the grid. Detachment from schedules was literally the appeal.
Right, no cell phones tracking your location.
Exactly. If a traveler from Germany or the UK missed a scheduled phone call home from some payphone in Sydney, families usually assumed they were just out of range in the outback.
Or having too much fun to find a post office.
Yeah. It took weeks, sometimes months, before a family across the globe realized that a missed call actually equaled a disappearance. That built-in delay weaponized time against the families and gave the killer a massive head start.
So the very culture of freedom became the trap.
Exactly.
God. But that terrifying limbo for the families, it finally shattered in September 1992 when the physical evidence came to light in the most brutal way imaginable.
In Belanglo.
Yeah, 2 runners were out orienteering in the Belanglo State Forest, and they noticed this foul smell near a boulder in a gully ominously mapped as Executioner's Drop.
The name itself is just chilling.
I know. And what they found was a decaying corpse hidden under a mound of branches. The next day, police found a second body nearby. It was Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters.
And the physical state of the remains provided investigators with a grim but incredibly detailed behavioral profile. Joanne had been stabbed 15 times, including these really deep wounds to her spine, and Caroline had been shot 10 times in the head. And then over a year later, in October and November 1993, police sweeps of that exact same forest uncovered the rest of the victims.
And the escalation is disturbing. James Gibson was found in a fetal position with upper spine knife wounds. Deborah Everest had been savagely beaten and stabbed. Simone Schmidl was found with her spine severed.
The violence is just staggering.
It is. And the discovery of the final German couple was horrifying. Gabor had been shot 6 times in the head, and Anja had been decapitated.
Yeah.
And despite massive forensic searches of the forest, her skull was never found.
What investigators are reading in these crime scenes is absolute control. Severing a spine isn't necessarily about causing death. It is a mechanical tool designed to paralyze.
To make them helpless.
Right. It immobilizes the victim, allowing the killer to extend the terror and assert total dominance. Furthermore, we see a clear escalation of violence over the timeline. He goes from stabbing and shooting to ritualistic decapitation.
There are also these incredibly macabre calling cards left at the scenes. Like, the bodies were all hidden under meticulously constructed pyramid-like mounds of sticks and ferns.
Not just haphazardly covered.
No, carefully built. And the killer had actually set up campsites nearby, which indicates he spent a significant amount of time with the victims post-mortem. And there was this bizarre detail of partial undressing. Zippers down, but top buttons fastened. He wasn't just hiding bodies, he was curating a scene. It's like the forest wasn't just a dumping ground. It was this private, twisted theater. A psychological vault where he could safely store and revisit his power.
A psychological vault is exactly the right framework. The campsites tell us he was very comfortable in that environment. He wasn't panicking or rushing to flee the way an opportunistic killer might.
Right, he was hanging around.
He was savoring the environment, and this tells investigators they are looking for a local, someone who knows the dense, uniform pine plantations of Belanglo so well that they can navigate it in the pitch dark without getting disoriented.
So with 7 bodies recovered, the New South Wales police mobilize. They form Task Force Air, led by Superintendent Clive Small. But, if you're Superintendent Small, you are staring down a logistical nightmare.
Oh, an absolute mountain of noise.
Yeah, you have a $500,000 reward,
Yeah.
which generates over 1 million tip-offs and 10,000 viable leads.
Yeah.
How do you find one man in a country of 17 million when the only physical links are some scattered shell casings and tire tracks in the dirt?
Well, you have to rely on data intersection. Task Force Air utilized an early computer system called NetMap. Now, in the early 90s, police didn't have modern algorithms that could automatically flag a suspect for them.
Sure.
NetMap functioned essentially as a digital sieve. Investigators poured in massive, seemingly unconnected data sets, like who owned a specific type of four-wheel drive, who lived in the surrounding rural areas, who held certain gun licenses, and even gym memberships.
So they are taking these massive lists and literally layering them over each other.
Exactly.
If you're on the gun registry, you're one of thousands. If you're on the vehicle registry, you're one of thousands. But when you layer the gun registry, the vehicle registry, the geographic proximity, and a history of violence on top of each other, the mesh gets tighter.
It filters out the noise.
Yeah. And they use this system to whittle a list of 230 suspects down to 32.
And that data confirmed their profile. The killer was blue-collar, given his physical strength to move bodies and construct those mounds. He was an experienced hunter with a four-wheel drive vehicle. But most crucially, data and profiles are abstract.
Right, you can't arrest a spreadsheet.
Exactly. To secure a warrant and make an arrest, investigators needed a human face to connect to the data.
They needed a witness, and they got one when a ghost from the killer's past stepped forward.
Paul Onions.
Yes. In January 1990, a British backpacker named Paul Onions accepted a ride out of Sydney from a man who called himself Bill. Bill drove a silver Nissan four-wheel drive and sported a handlebar mustache. They're driving south, nearing the Belanglo State Forest, when Bill suddenly pulls over, draws a revolver, and pulls out some ropes.
And there it is. It is the exact mechanical modus operandi the killer used to control his other victims. The vehicle, the isolated highway, the ropes.
But Onions makes a split-second decision that alters the course of the investigation. He realizes that staying in the vehicle means certain death.
Fight or flight.
And he chooses flight. He bails out of the Nissan and runs for his life down the highway, literally dodging bullets as Bill shoots at him.
It's like something out of a movie.
It really is. He runs toward moving traffic, which is his only mechanical survival option, and manages to flag down a passing motorist, Joanne Berry, who speeds him to safety. Onions reports it to local police, but the report tragically gets lost in the filing system.
Which is just heartbreaking.
Infuriating. Fast forward to 1993. Onions is back in the UK, hears international news about bodies found in Belanglo, and he calls the Australian police.
Onions was the missing link. Until he called, police had a behavioral profile and a pile of ballistics, but they were essentially ghost hunting. Onions provided a physical description that perfectly matched Ivan Milat.
The mustache, the build.
Right. When investigators ran his description of the silver Nissan and the attacker through their NetMap suspect list, Milat's name was the one caught in the sieve.
And then the forensics lock it into place. The ballistics from the crime scenes, specifically the .22 caliber Ruger 1022 rifle casings found near the bodies, matched weapons known to be favored by Milat.
Because every time a gun is fired, the barrel leaves microscopic, unique scratches on the casing, like a fingerprint.
Exactly. So Onions provided the behavioral bridge, and the ballistics provided the undeniable forensic anchor.
Which gave Task Force Air exactly what they needed to execute a tactical takedown. On May 22, 1994, at dawn, 50 heavily armed tactical officers surrounded Milat's home in Eaglevale.
No taking chances.
None. They breached the house and arrested him. But the arrest itself was just the beginning of what they uncovered inside.
Right, because as investigators search the property, they start finding these incredibly macabre items hidden in plain sight. Yeah. They find Simone Schmill's water bottle. They find Carolyn Clark's camera. The victim's sleeping bags are folded in his closets. They find foreign currency. They even find the actual parts of the Ruger rifle hidden inside the wall cavities of the house.
And let's not forget what they found at his mother's house.
Right. At his mother's house, locked in a cupboard, they find a cavalry sword. It just forces a glaring question. I mean, why? Why would a killer who is careful enough to bury bodies under meticulously constructed mounds in a remote forest be arrogant enough to keep the victim's camping gear in his own closets?
It seems sloppy, right?
It completely contradicts the idea of a careful, calculating mastermind.
Well, that's because keeping trophies is never about logic. It is about psychological gratification. A serial offender doesn't view a water bottle or a sleeping bag as evidence. They view it as a tangible connection to the absolute control they exerted over that victim.
Wow.
It's like a battery they use to recharge their grandiosity. They can hold that camera and relive the power and the thrill of the murder long after the physical act is over.
It's a profound arrogance. He genuinely believed he was smarter than the police, that his psychological vault in the forest and his physical vault in his home were impenetrable.
And that arrogance is precisely what became his undoing. The physical evidence found during that raid was overwhelming, transitioning the case from a manhunt to a monumental 15-week trial, which began in March 1996.
But, finding the trophies in his house is one thing, but proving he acted alone and actually pulled the trigger is another. When Milat finally faced a jury, his defense strategy was an absolute spectacle of manipulation.
It was bizarre.
He denied everything, but he didn't just claim ignorance. He actively tried to frame his own brothers, Richard and Walter. He claimed that they must have committed the murders and planted the evidence in his house to frame him.
It was a deeply cynical tactic. Taking the witness stand in your own murder trial is incredibly risky, and Milat's performance under cross-examination proved exactly why.
He fell apart.
He was evasive, his timelines were contradictory, and his attempts to shift the blame were entirely unconvincing to the jury.
To me, it is the ultimate betrayal. Here you have a man from this fiercely loyal, tight-knit clan, a family that, by all accounts, covered for each other's minor infractions for decades. And the moment the walls close in, he is perfectly willing to throw his own flesh and blood into a maximum security prison cell just to save himself.
Absolutely ruthless.
But the jury saw right through it. On July 27, 1996, they found Ivan Milat guilty on all counts. He received 7 consecutive life sentences, plus 18 years for the attack on Paul Onions.
However, the closure of the trial came with a deeply unsettling caveat.
The judge's comment.
Right. The presiding judge offered a chilling observation during sentencing. When you look at the sheer logistics of subduing, controlling, and murdering pairs of healthy adults in an isolated forest, the spatial and physical requirements are immense.
2 against 1 is tough odds, even with a gun.
Exactly. The judge stated it was highly probable that Ivan Milat did not act alone. That shadow of doubt, the idea of an accomplice, has haunted this case ever since.
And those lingering shadows only grew darker as the years went on. Milat was locked away in maximum security, where his need for control manifested in really bizarre, violent ways.
He couldn't handle being powerless.
No. He tried to mastermind an escape, which ended with his accomplice in the plot, George Savas, taking his own life. And when Milat couldn't manipulate the system, he turned his violence inward. He swallowed razor blades. He literally cut off his own finger to try and force a transfer to a different facility.
Wow.
It was all a desperate bid to regain the dominance he once held in the forest.
But he eventually died of cancer in prison in October 2019, taking his secrets to the grave without ever confessing. But the echo of his crimes hasn't faded, primarily because the math of his timeline doesn't quite add up.
Right, the cold cases.
Yes, there are still cold cases linked to his specific method of operation. Victims like Peter Letcher, Karen Rowland, and several missing women from the Newcastle area whose disappearances align perfectly with his movements.
Not to mention the shocking deathbed statement from his former lawyer, John Marsden. Marsden claimed that Milat absolutely had an accomplice in the murders of the 2 British backpackers. He suggested it was a sister or another woman who helped him maintain control over the victims.
And we have to consider the profound tragedy of the unknown here. The physical evidence, the ballistics, the trophies, the net map data, it successfully closed the book on 7 murders, providing a measure of justice.
Sure.
But the behavioral patterns, the timeline gaps, and the logistical reality of managing pairs of victims leave investigators staring at the chilling probability that the true body count is much, much higher.
It left a permanent cultural scar on Australia. It inspired horror films like Wolf Creek, it altered the way a nation viewed hitchhiking, and really ended an era of sun-drenched innocence.
It changed everything.
It did. But as we wrap up this deep dive, we are left with a final provocative thought for you to consider. Look at the mechanical evidence. If subduing 2 adults at once in the dark brush of Belanglo required a second set of hands.
Which is highly likely.
Right. It means someone who helped orchestrate this nightmare, someone who stood in that forest and watched, might still be walking free today, enjoying the very life they helped steal from 7 young backpackers. Thanks for listening to The Evidence Room. If you enjoyed this episode, like and subscribe for more true crime investigations from around the world. Remember, some cases remain unsolved, but the evidence always tells a story.